pursuing scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
Coming up, Technocracy News. And greetings from Technocracy News and Trends. This is Patrick Wood, Editor-in-Chief and founder of Technocracy News and Trends, and welcome to the program today. We're going to take another stab at global warming and the climate hysteria that is persisting around the world. It certainly just will not go away on its own because it's being backed and pushed by the very global elite that brought it to us. The first story that I want to bring up today is picked from Armstrong Economics. And Martin Armstrong is a venerable economist, been around for some time, great writer, very insightful. And he's written an article on his blog. I have titled this article, No Evidence of Human-Induced Climate Change. And this is a slightly different view because he is an economist, not a scientist per se. He's not a PhD from Harvard or Yale or Princeton in climate science, but rather he is an economist. I wrote at the top of this that Armstrong is exactly correct when he states, quote, "This is not about facts or logic. It's about a new world order under the control of the United Nations. It is opposed to capitalism and freedom and has made environmental catastrophism a household topic to achieve its objective." And of course, this is exactly what Technocracy News has been saying for years now, as well as the information I've presented in both of my books, starting with Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. Armstrong writes, "Climate has always changed from decade to decade. There were major swings during the 1930s. You had the Dust Bowl during the summer, and in 1936 you had record cold. The 1936 North American cold wave, which also hit Japan and China, still rank among the most intense cold waves in the recorded history of North America. You cannot blame this on soccer moms driving the kids around town burning fossil fuels. Cars were a luxury in the 1930s still. There is just no evidence of human-induced climate change. There is nobody willing to call them out on this nonsense with just showing the dramatic swings in temperature over the centuries." Here is a piece that appeared in the Weekend Australian on the covert issues behind the curtain. And the Weekend Australian had this headline, "The UN is using climate change as a tool, not an issue." It's a well-kept secret, he writes, but 95% of the climate models, we are told, prove the link between human CO2 emissions and catastrophic global warming have been found after nearly 2 decades of temperature stasis to be in error. It's not surprising. We have been subjected to extravagance from climate catastrophists for close to 50 years. In January 1970, Life magazine, based on, quote, "solid scientific evidence," close quote, claimed that by 1985, pollution would reduce the sunlight reaching the Earth by half. In fact, across that period, sunlight fell between 3% and 5%. In a 1971 speech, Paul Ehrlich said, quote, "If I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not exist by the year 2000, close quote. Fast forward to March 2000, and David Viner, senior research scientist at the Climatic Research Unit, University of East Anglia, told The Independent, quote, "Snowfalls are now a thing of the past," close quote. In December 2010, the Mail Online reported, quote, "Coldest December since records began as temperatures plummet to minus 10 Celsius, bringing travel chaos across Britain," close quote. We've had our own busted predictions. Perhaps the most preposterous was climate alarmist Tim Flannery's 2005 observation, if the computer records are right, these drought conditions will become permanent in eastern Australia, close quote. Subsequent rainfall and severe flooding have shown the records or his analysis are wrong. We've swallowed dud prediction after dud prediction. What's more, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is the IPCC, which we were instructed was the gold standard on global warming, has been exposed repeatedly for misrepresentation and shoddy methods. Weather bureaus appear to have homogenized data to suit narratives. NASA's claim that 2014 was the warmest year on record was revised after challenge to only 38% probability. Extreme weather events, once blamed on global warming, no longer are, as their frequency and intensity decline. Why then, with such little evidence, does the UN insist the world spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on futile climate change policies? Perhaps Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the UN's Framework on Climate Change, has the answer. In Brussels last February, she said, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution." Close quote. In other words, the real agenda is concentrated political authority. Global warming is the hook. Figueres is on record saying democracy is a poor political system for fighting global warming. Communist China, she says, is the best model. This is not about facts or logic. It's about the New World Order under control of the United Nations. It is opposed to capitalism and freedom and has made environmental catastrophism a household topic to achieve its objective. Figueres says that, unlike the Industrial Revolution, quote, "This is a centralized transformation that is taking place," close quote. She sees the U.S. partisan divide on global warming as very detrimental. Of course, in her authoritarian world, there will be no room for debate or disagreement. Make no mistake, climate change is a must-win battlefield for authoritarians and fellow travelers. As Timothy Wirth, president of the UN Foundation, says, quote, "Even if the climate change theory is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic and environmental policy," close quote. Having gained so much ground, eco-catastrophists won't let up. Well, this is an article worth reading. From an economics point of view, you follow the money, you follow the power. The only companies that are getting rich on this are those which are dedicated to global warming, whether it be the Caterpillar tractors or the John Deeres or the Siemens or the NVIDIAs or the big tech companies of the world. They are lined up to receive a windfall of profit off of green spending. Everybody else is going to be the one who pays the piper. They will be guaranteed to get poorer, not richer, as we have seen in the last 40 years. The next story relates very closely to the first story, except that the source is a very well-known climate scientist by the name of Dr. Mototaka Nakamura, and he writes about the sorry state of climate science. His book, Confessions of a Climate Scientist, The Global Warming Hypothesis, is an unproven hypothesis. It spills the beans on faulty data and faulty climate models as the sorry state of climate science. This is an important article to read because Nakamura is an important climate scientist who knows his stuff. This article states, there's a top-level oceanographer and meteorologist who is prepared to cry nonsense on the global warming crisis evident to climate modelers, but not in the real world. He's as well or better qualified than the modelers he criticizes, the ones whose year 2100 forebodings of the 4 degrees Celsius warming have set the world to spending $1.5 trillion a year to combat CO2 emissions. In June, he put out a small book in Japanese on the sorry state of climate science. It's titled Confessions of a Climate Scientist. The global warming hypothesis is an unproven hypothesis. and he is very much qualified to take a stand. From 1990 to 2014, he worked on cloud dynamics and forces mixing atmospheric and ocean flows on medium to planetary scales. His bases were MIT for a Doctor of Science in Meteorology, Georgia Institute of Technology, Goddard Space Flight Center, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Duke and Hawaii Universities, and the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Sciences and Technology. He's published about 20 climate papers on fluid dynamics. Today's vast panoply of, quote, global warming science, close quote, is like an upside-down pyramid built on the work of a few score of serious climate modelers. They claim to have demonstrated human-derived CO2 emissions as the cause of recent global warming and project that warming forward. Every orthodox climate researcher takes such output from modelers' black boxes as a given. A fine example is from the Australian Academy of Sciences explanatory booklet of 2015. It claims, absurdly, that the model's outputs are compelling evidence for human-caused warming. Specifically, it refers to model runs with and without human emissions and finds that with variety better rematches the 150-year temperature record, which is itself a highly dubious construct. Thus satisfied, the Academy then propagates to the public and politicians the model's forecast for disastrous warming this century. Now for Dr. Nakamura's expert demolition of the modeling. There was no English edition of this book in June, and only a few bits were translated and circulated. But Dr. Nakamura last week offered a free Kindle version, his own version in plain English. It's not a translation, but a fresh essay leading back to his original conclusions. The temperature forecasting models trying to deal with the intractable complexities of the climate are no better than toys or Mickey Mouse mockeries of the real world, he says. This is not actually a radical idea. The IPCC, in its third report in 2001, conceded, quote, in climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we're dealing with a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore that the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. Even the IPCC said that. Somehow, that official warning was deep-sixed by the alarmist. Now Nakamura has found it again, further accusing the orthodox science of data falsification by adjusting previous temperature data to increase apparent warming. Quote, the global surface mean temperature change data no longer have any scientific value and are nothing except a propaganda tool to the public, he writes. The climate models are useful tools for academic studies, he said. However, the models can become useless pieces of junk or worse in the sense that they can produce gravely misleading output, when they are used for climate forecasting. The reason, quote, he says, these models completely lack some critically important climate processes and feedbacks and represent some other critically important climate processes and feedbacks in grossly distorted manners to the extent that makes these models totally useless for any meaningful climate prediction. I myself used to use climate simulation models for scientific studies, not for predictions, and learned about their problems and limitations in the process. Well, this article goes on. It's a great piece. We appreciate the fact that Dr. Nakamura has come out and laid some common sense and some actual scientific common sense on top of the global warming hysteria that we see all around the world. However, we need to remember that those who are completely sold on global warming have turned it into a religion and have very little interest in the facts of the matter. Facts do not move them. Facts do not change their opinion. Facts only seem to get them more angry and more assertive in browbeating everybody else as being climate deniers, etc. I don't know what they would say to Dr. Nakamura. He's a top scientist in the top of his field. A climate denier? I don't know. I think he makes a lot of sense to me. The last article is slightly related, has to do with China. China's renewable energy boom has hit the wall. Now, we all know that China has pledged to lead the world on sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals promoted by the United Nations. This is their boast, that they will be the leader in the world on sustainable development. So they have indeed put a lot of money into renewable energy. They have solar fields, they have windmills, they have hydroelectric dams that have been built. And China, however, with its 1.4 billion people in population, has come to the end of their forecasting rope when it comes to alternative energy. I wrote at the top of this, renewable energy in China is an impossibility. When the nation demands cheap energy from coal, oil, and gas to fuel its expected growth through 2050. Other nations are in the same predicament. Renewable energy sources simply cannot provide enough reliable energy to fuel economic growth in the future. This article states, when earlier this year, China announced subsidies for 22.79 gigawatts of new solar power capacity, those following the country's renewable energy story must have started to worry. The capacity subsidized is half the amount provided in 2017 at 53 gigawatts, and chances are that solar and wind additions will continue to fall. Subsidies are one reason. In January, Beijing said it will only approve solar power projects if they are cost competitive with coal. Judging by the size of subsidies announced in July, more than 22 gigawatts in projects can boast cost competitiveness with coal. Yet there's another reason, curtailment. China-based journalist Michael Standard wrote in a recent story for Yale Environment 360 that China's solar and wind farms continue to produce electricity that is wasted because there is not enough transmission capacity. Renewable energy is a top priority for China as it fights one of the worst air pollution levels in the world while subject to an uncomfortably high degree of reliance on energy imports, namely oil and gas. At the same time, it is one of the biggest, if not the single biggest, driver of global energy demand as its middle class grows fast, and with it, energy demand. Now it seems energy demand is taking the upper hand. China has substantially increased subsidies for shale gas exploration and methane separation from coal. He also notes a former IEA official is saying, quote, though China is the largest clean energy market in the world, wind and solar only account for 5.2% and 2.5% of China's national power generation in 2018. There's nothing more to say about this. This last sentence basically says it all. Despite his best efforts, wind power is only accounting for 5.2% of energy required, and solar is only providing another 2.5%. Adding those two together, 7.7% of China's energy is coming from solar or wind power. That's alternative energy. There is no way on this green earth that China can produce enough solar and or wind power to fuel its growth out towards 2050. It just will not happen. So in the meantime, China is developing sources of energy along the traditional line with coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear as well. The alternative energy model is simply failing all around the world. And yet, climate alarmists still drive the alternative energy propaganda machine. Oil and gas, all fossil fuels are bad. All alternative energy is good. Drive out the bad, bring in the new. And if they are successful, by the way, energy production will collapse and economic activity will collapse as well. I will suggest that the United Nations does nothing to stop this charade because they are promoting reduction of resource usage in the world, not an increase. The only way to do that is to decrease the energy available, which will automatically pull economic activity down, and along with it, the consumption of additional resources. And the United Nations is all about curtailing the use of resources in the world. This is just common sense. Well, I'm Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. We'll see you next time.